Hello, my name is Lisa Beaudoin, and I'd like to welcome you to the Dynamics of Abuse presentational series, Part 4, The Other Violators, written and hosted by Lisa L. Beaudoin. In this session, Session 4, we'll be talking about how the model of this theory of mine also seems to work fundamentally with other types of abuse, including addiction. And we'll break it down into different scenarios as well as different violator types. As we advance through each slide, you'll see the menu topics located on the far left side of the slide, with the slide that we're currently on highlighted in red. Also, as this presentation includes a great deal of additional information, such as child abuse definitions and other topics that support my theory, at times you'll see a source internet link on the bottom of the slide of where I've gotten that information. Also, please know that everything that's presented in these video sessions are based on my experiences and my interpretations only. I'm not the doctor or a therapist. I'm the patient. So I'm simply here to convey the experiences that I've gone through, along with some educational tools and theories, many of them that I've come up with myself, to try to help others so that they don't suffer the things that I have. And before we continue, I must also warn you that this presentation contains topics such as abuse, violent and sexual behaviors, and addictions. Therefore, viewer discretion is advised. And please know, you are never alone. If you or someone you know is suffering from abuse of any kind, please call 911 immediately. So please, reach out to one of those groups if you need help. In the first 3 videos, I've talked a bit about myself, the CAPT Act, and my theory and why I think we need one. And I'm going to have you recall what I said in video 2. The skepticism, along with any unhealthy attitude or action in our society, should be met with objection, but then followed with reflection, and then a determined decision to change the negative outcomes to positive ones. Hard facts are what we need for change. And as I love to study almost everything, including ancient writings, a few months back I was about to read Homer's Iliad, when in the introduction I read this. Skepticism is as much the result of knowledge as knowledge is of skepticism. To be content with what we at present know is for the most part to shut our ears against conviction, since from the very gradual character of our education we must continually forget and emancipate ourselves from knowledge previously acquired. We must set aside old notions and embrace fresh ones, and as we learn, we must be daily unlearning something which it has cost us no small labor and anxiety to acquire. Wow, it's the same exact thing I'm trying to say, and the whole point of this entire video presentation. The videos may not be perfect, and the things that are talked about in these videos are at times difficult, controversial, and even scary, as well as very different from mainstream ideas. But these ideas and theories are what help me make a better world for myself, to understand others as well as myself, and try to cope with the day-to-day obstacles I face due to having mental conditions. So it may be that some of this sounds a bit out there, but maybe just one thing that I share with you will ring true for you, and that one thing may affect you or be something you end up using or sharing with others. Then the videos have done what I hope, and there are many people out there today trying to do the same thing, to make changes, if ever so slight, which is what I'm hoping to do. And in a great sense, these videos are basically what I call my playbook. It is the same thing government and businesses make when they are working out their policies. Everything from fire exits and safety issues to disciplinary topics. So my playbook is what helps me when I'm struggling and trying to understand why my parents did what they did to me, why people do what they do to others and sometimes even themselves, and even why I think and do the things I do. So I'd like to suggest for you to create your own playbook. It's quite easy. You just get a binder with some loose leaf paper and maybe some sticky index tabs to group things together. Then keep everything that you're learning about that's going to help you in your life, about yourself, including videos like mine and other research, but just as importantly, your own insights on specific topics. Another great idea is if you have children to have a family playbook, where you write down the decisions of what type of parent you want to be, as well as everything on what type of discipline you want to put in place, and the insights on how to protect and keep your children safe while helping them become the best they can be. A great start on that topic would be to go back to video 2 where I discussed the CAPTA Act, the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, and then research that more. Yes, true, it is where we in the United States get our laws on child abuse prevention and our definitions on child abuse. But it is also the best definitions on what not to do to a child, because this definition, which started in 1974, has grown and is ever being based on statistical study of certain actions that are done to children and the negative impact that they have on those children during their youth, but also throughout their lifetime. So aside from seeing this as the definitions used to create laws here in the United States, why not use this type of thinking as a fundamental base when making decisions in your family playbook? And the best thing about having your own playbook is that you and your partner can work on this together, making changes or adding things when you want and as needed or thought of. It's all totally up to you. Now, throughout the first few videos of this presentation, I've suggested to have a binder and some loose leaf paper. But now I'm going to strongly suggest, because from this point on, I'm going to at times ask you to stop the video and do some drills or exercises, if you will. This is so that you actually look at these scenarios a little more closely. Yes, you could just think this out in your head, but it's much better to write it out on paper. And later on in the video, I'll explain more about why that's so important. So now on with the presentation on the violator types. So let's begin by recapping what we talked about in session 3 about the theory I have on the dynamics of abuse, of how I came to those dynamics by researching how a tornado forms, which there are 4 main dynamics as the tornado forms and 1 dynamic that keeps it on the ground. The first dynamic is the supercell thunderstorm, which is a very tall storm with high winds, a lot of lightning that's creating an electrical force, and hailstones and water that create and hold the moisture in the tornado. The next is the rising heated air that becomes energy of upward drafts that turns, circling the clouds into a vortex. The third dynamic is the cool seeking air that wraps around the vortex, turning it into a funnel as it moves downward. And then the fourth dynamic being the increasing wind speed that draws that funnel down to the ground to create a touchdown. With the fifth dynamic being all those 4 dynamics gaining momentum together, usually creating a much larger diameter because all those 4 dynamics are now entwined and magnified to keep the tornado on the ground. So first of all, if any of those dynamics dissipate, so does the tornado. But just as important, if any of those 4 dynamics are missing, then the tornado never forms in the first place. So with that same type of thinking about how a tornado forms, this is how I came to understand how child abuse forms and why I created the dynamics of abuse. It's just a very simplistic model of how there are certain conditions in the mindset of a person that causes them to violate others. In the first dynamic, at this point, a violator is just a subject, someone who has had something happen to them that's the predisposition of abuse. It's the potential. You can look at this as a storm growing and going on in their mind, and this storm can be caused due to many types of things, which these things are called variables. In the next dynamic is where the abusive roles take shape. At this point, the victim is just a target of abuse, but as these roles take shape, so too do the violator's delusional affirmations. In fact, as the roles become more evident to the violator, this boosts those delusions. It's like the electrical part of a tornado as it's encouraging the violator more and more into this delusion, which that is a part of and leads the subject into the third dynamic, the delusional affirmations taking shape and forming this person's mindset. This is where arguments in their mind might be occurring and they might be weighing out choices, but other negative variables are having a major impact on their thoughts, driving that subject on, thinking that what they're thinking about doing is okay to do. In fact, once these affirmations have gained enough momentum, I believe what's now happened is that during these first dynamics, this delusional belief has now wrapped itself around the subject, meaning that what the subject is thinking of doing seems to be the only choice they have. So then the next dynamic of this subject will be to use grooming tools on that target. And these grooming tools can vary. Everything from I love you to I'm going to hurt you to using force on that target. Then once the abuse occurs, momentum builds and the violator will want to continue the delusion, now using the dynamic 5, grounding tools. These grounding tools are very much like grooming tools, except that now they're intensified as the tornadic mechanisms of that abuse get stronger, just like an actual tornado getting stronger once it's touched down to the ground. So now that we've reviewed the 5 dynamics of abuse, I also want to clarify just a little bit more the definition of what a violator is and what exactly is the delusion. In the last video, which is video 3, we looked up the definition of a violator, which is someone who's infringing upon another, hurting them either physically, mentally, or sexually, or a combination of all those things. The delusion is that somehow this person, who goes from being the subject to a violator, has convinced themselves through certain things, the variables, that appear to happen in this pattern, that the violation is perfectly okay to do. Sometimes that it's justifiable, sometimes that it's just meant to be. All of that thinking is the delusion, and that leads the subject into the abuse. The only thing changing are the variables as to what, where, who, and why. So if we take a look at the diagram of abusive roles directly across from the 5th dynamic of grounding tools, this is where the violator's delusional beliefs have now wrapped around the violator, the victim, and witnesses, which witnesses are those who have seen or know for sure that an abuse has occurred. Another important thing to note is that the actual abuse is part of the delusion. Take a moment to think on this, as this is something that I think is very important to understand. The abuse is part of the delusion. It's an affirmation magnifying the delusional belief in the mindset of the violator and all those involved. But I also think that the abuse itself is a grounding tool of the violator to help them ground that delusion, with both the verbal and physical parts of the abuse wrapping that delusion more firmly around everyone involved. It's a controlling variable within the pattern of grounding, like the violators trying to say, and especially to themselves, see, what I'm doing is perfectly okay to do, when in reality, that's just in the violator's mind. But the whole point of this presentation is to get everyone aware of these dynamics, because without understanding them and how they work, sometimes this delusion can be wrapped around everybody involved during and even years after the abuse has stopped. So in reviewing this theory of mine on the dynamics of abuse, which is the potential pattern mindset of a violator, there are 4 dynamics that basically create abuse using many variables, and then 1 dynamic that keeps the abuse grounded while it continues. In a moment, we're going to be using sexual abuse as an example to see how these dynamics work, but I think it's very important to understand that just like in actual tornado's dynamics, if the delusion is broken in any of the first 4 dynamics by any role, then the abuse stops. And if the delusion doesn't get the opportunity to grow at all, well, then the abuse doesn't even take place. With that, we have to ask ourselves the question, what makes a violator? Well, here are some, but not all of the ways that I've researched. Maybe a violator is a victim or survivor of abuse themselves, or suffering from some type of mental or medical condition. It could be that they've had a traumatic event happen in their life, or that these beliefs have been passed on. Possibly, they also have a great amount of anger or rage, which would put them into a fight or flight mode. If this is the case, then they are quick to act on impulse, and it's very difficult to think things through. So now it's time to do a little bit of thinking and get out the binder and paper. What I'd like you to do is to stop this video for a little bit and look up 2 instances of sexual abuse. One of a personal nature where someone has incested their own child, and then one that's more of a public figure, where a person has sexually abused many children. Read up on those cases and then take a look at the abusive roles in each case. Can you see how the abusive roles are there within those situations? Next, it's hard enough to be able to know enough about a violator to identify the first 2 dynamics, but there are many shows now out there that do violator interviews, So you could watch those types of shows, but if not, at least try to identify the grooming tools and then the grounding tools of the violator. Well, I'm hoping you took a minute on that last slide to look up the information about two situations of sexual violations, one that's more of a personal nature and one that's more of a public nature. And so the questions I'm going to ask you now are based on the 5 dynamics at work and the variables that go with it, plus the abusive roles. So here's the first question. Can you recognize when the violator became delusional? Now, you can only do this if you've gotten some information about the violator. The next question is, did you find out any information on a variable that caused the delusion to be affirmed? And if so, what were they? Looking at the abusive roles, could you identify who was the violator, who was the victim, and who was the witnesses? Then, what was the type of witnesses in those cases? Which usually in sexually abusive cases, the witnesses are probably a victim themselves, someone that is also being violated, a spouse, or another violator. All right, next question. What grooming tools were used on the target? And how about the grounding tools? Then the same goes for the witnesses or witness. What were the grooming tools versus the grounding tools? And were these tools used on the witnesses the same that were used on targets? Finally, how did the abuse end? Who reported it? Was it a witness or a bystander? Was it the victim or maybe even the violators themselves? As statistical data does show that sometimes violators turn themselves in. And now that we've applied a few situations when it comes to the dynamics of abuse, the patterns and the variables, I'd like to expand on those dynamic patterns and show how this theory of mine also seems to work with every type of abuse, which I've categorized violators into people, substances, and activities. So the first type of violator would be a person. Again, this is someone who has a false belief that the abuse that they're inflicting on someone else is perfectly within their right to do so, and they will use violator grooming and grounding tools, as well as the delusional circle that they've got in their own mind to spread and try to keep the abuse continuing. And while I could go through many of these situations of abuse that I have on here, which I'm sure there are many other types, I think it's more important that you take the time to think about these abusive situations and see if you can work out the dynamics on each situation, because then once you've done that, you can also recognize how to prevent some of these abuses from happening to you. For example, the violator of a scam feels that they have the right to take your money or something from you, and they will use lies as grooming tools and continue those lies as grounding tools to get more money. Or computer hacking. A hacker is a violator who believes they have the right to gain access into your computer to take your information. The grooming tools that they would use is that if you don't have the right security on your computer or if you don't update your passwords. So this whole process of what we're doing here is what I call becoming mindful. We are working out situations of abuse and looking at the grooming tools in a polarized way to protect ourselves. So now what I'd like you to do is get that binder out again and write these situations of abuse down, identifying the grooming tools of each one of these abusive situations, and then applying those in a more polarized and personal way, such as in the case of a computer hacker, making it a rule to change your computer's passwords every second day of the month so as to dissuade a hacker access into your computer. Or in the case of burglary, making sure that you have motion detectors and lights on at your home, that you have noise to dissuade a burglar from trying to enter into your home. And by putting this all into your binder, into your playbook, this means not only are you becoming mindful, you are becoming proactive in situations prior to them happening to you. The next violator grouping is substance abuse. Now, there are many definitions out there on addiction, but my definition of an addiction is a habit that is causing a negative impact on a person or persons, whether it be physically, mentally, financially, socially, or all of the above. And the dynamics works the same way, except the only difference in this model is that the substance is the violator that's creating a delusion around the user, who's the victim. that the victim cannot live without that substance. Whether it's alcohol, drugs, sugar, or some type of glue or aerosol, that substance has wrapped around the brain, the body, and the mind of the victim. Now, there are obviously many ways or variables that this happens, but in understanding this fundamental pattern first, and then going out and finding out how these variables work on that victim, the chances are much better in removing an addiction. Now, I myself have personally removed addictions, and I do talk about that in another video that also goes into substance violation in more detail, which I call that video The Lady in the Kitchen. So if you want to go watch that after this one, please do so. But right now what we're doing is we're just looking at becoming fundamentally more aware of the abusive patterns. The final violator type is activities, which work the same way as substances. Now we're talking about addictions here. So again, the activity is the violator that's wrapped itself around the user who, if they are addicted, has become the victim. And that victim thinks that they cannot live without that activity, causing a very negative impact on that person in some way. Activities such as too much television or online computer games, social media platforms, and other things like gambling and sexual addictions, and many other activities that again cause a negative impact on a person. So let's get our binders out again and just take a moment to think about the model of the dynamics of abuse for both substances and activity violations, which are also known as addictions. And then let's think about and write down 2 situations of each violator type and what the grooming and grounding tools would be for those situations that would create an addiction. And the very best way to do that is to have your own playbook, to have worked out these types of situations so that you don't get wrapped into them. Writing out different types of violation, abusive roles, and the grooming and grounding tools used in those violations. And then what you do is you polarize those tools, working out what you can do so that you don't become a victim in those situations. And so, we're coming to the end of this video, but so far in this presentation, we've now covered a lot of information. In the first video, we talked a little bit about me, and then in the second one of why we need a theory, and the statistics, and the CAPTA Act. In the third video, we talked about the dynamics of abuse, and now in this video, we've showed how this model of abuse also seems to work on every type of abuse, every situation, and also different violator types. Up to now, I've only suggested that you use a binder, but in this video, I've really tried to encourage you to do so. Not only using it to write things down, but also to do some exercises or drills. And there's a reason for that. Right now, I'm going to ask you to do something with me. And no, it's not hypnosis. I just want you to take a deep breath and then hold your hands out in front of you. Then I want you to look at your right hand. Then to focus on your right thumb. And then I want you to take your right thumb and wiggle it 3 times with me. 1, 2, 3. That's it. Now, I'm sure you're raising your eyebrows, wondering why I asked you to do this. Well, let me explain. You see, the whole process of wiggling the thumb is a metaphor that I use not only to understand how abuse works, but also how to identify and combat it in many different types of situations. And in the next video on how I identify and remove trauma due to being abused. Metaphorically speaking, after being abused, I avoided and did everything I could not to look at my hands. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that I finally started to see them. And now through years and years of soul searching and research and therapy, I began to understand more and do what I call wiggling the thumb. And so metaphorically, I've been doing the same thing in these videos. In video 1, I was raising awareness, which is drawing attention to the hands. In video 2, we talked about the history of child abuse and why we need a theory, then the CAPTA Act, the legal definition of child abuse here in the United States of America, which is bringing focus to the right hand. Then in video 3, when I described the dynamics of abuse and how it forms, this was to bring that focus from the right hand to the right thumb. And now in this video, I've expanded their dynamics and how they work in all models, in all situations of abuse, and the different violator types. But I've also asked you to really start writing down these scenarios, to do some exercises, to start wiggling your own thumb. And in the next video, I'll talk about how I identify and remove trauma, but also how I translate the traumatic process, and once dissolved, on how I translate the painful experiences, which is surprisingly quite different than mainstream thought. Because I truly believe the more we become mindful and educated on the topics of abuse, along with the tools we can use to stop or even prevent it, the more we will all live healthier and happier lives. This concludes Session 4 on the dynamics of abuse. Please find the link below to watch Session 5 to continue with this presentation.